It was an ordinary evening in the small town of El Paso, Texas. The sun was just beginning to set behind the rugged mountains, casting an orange glow over the streets. Life moved slowly here, where the heat of the desert met the pulse of everyday life. But in the house on the corner of Pinto Drive, everything was about to change. Melanie Collins sat on the couch, flipping through a magazine, the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan the only sound filling the room. She had always considered herself a good wife, a supportive partner to her husband, Officer Tom Collins, who worked for the El Paso Police Department. They had been married for 15 years, and although their relationship had its ups and downs, they had managed to raise a family together. Their son Jake was 15 years old, a quiet kid, but one who had always kept to himself, content with his video games and schoolwork. Melanie loved him dearly and always made sure to provide for his needs. But lately, things had felt different, distant, off-kilter. Melanie couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she could sense a change in her husband, Tom. He had become more distant, more distracted. Their once warm relationship had slowly turned cold, with their interactions becoming shorter, their conversations less frequent. Melanie had always trusted Tom. He was a good man, a good father, and a dedicated cop, or so she thought. But tonight, that trust would be shattered. It had been a long day for Tom, and he had arrived home late, as usual. Melanie, ever the dutiful wife, had dinner ready and waiting for him, but he barely touched it, retreating to the study with his phone in hand. Melanie's suspicions flared as she caught glimpses of the messages he was sending. The words on the screen seemed harmless enough, but the secrecy of it all made her uneasy. She told herself it was nothing, just the stress of his job, she reasoned. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, as the house grew quiet, Melanie heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. Tom was still awake, pacing back and forth. Melanie tried to sleep, but her mind raced with the thoughts she couldn't quiet. She knew something was going on and she needed to know the truth. As she tiptoed down the hallway, she heard hushed voices coming from the guest bedroom. She paused, listening intently. One of the voices was unmistakably Tom's, but the other? It sounded like a stranger. Melanie's heart began to race. She approached the door cautiously, peeking through the crack in the doorframe. Inside, she saw her worst nightmare unfold before her eyes. Tom, her husband of 15 years, was not alone. He was with another man, her son Jake. For a moment, everything stood still. The world outside the room disappeared. Melanie's mind couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. It felt like a cruel nightmare, one that she couldn't wake up from. Her heart pounded in her chest as the horror of the situation washed over her. The sight of her son in that position with her husband, the betrayal, the violation, it shattered her to the core. A surge of anger coursed through her veins. The man she had loved, the father of her child, had betrayed her in the worst way imaginable. The flood of emotions, disbelief, hurt, rage, hit her all at once. Her vision blurred, and she stepped back from the door, her legs shaking. The thought of confronting Tom in that moment didn't even cross her mind. What was there to say? What could she possibly say? She needed to act. She couldn't let this go. With quiet precision, Melanie retreated to the kitchen and grabbed the sharpest knife she could find. Her hands trembled as she gripped the handle, the cold steel pressing against her palm. She moved back down the hallway, her steps light, almost as if she were in a trance. Her mind was made up. There was no turning back now. She reached the door of the guest bedroom, pushed it open with quiet force, and stepped inside. There was no hesitation in her movements. Tom turned toward her, his face filled with shock and guilt. But it was too late. Melanie raised the knife, her eyes filled with a cold, calculated rage. "Melanie, please," Tom gasped. But it was no use. The love they once shared had been replaced by something far darker. With one swift motion, she drove the knife into his chest. Tom collapsed to the ground, blood spilling onto the floor, his life slipping away. But it wasn't just Tom she was punishing. She was punishing the betrayal, the years of lies, the destruction of her family. Her hands were soaked in his blood, but all she could feel was the cold rush of relief. It was over. Jake, still in shock, lay frozen on the floor. He didn't know how to react. He had witnessed the brutal act, and now he would have to live with it for the rest of his life. Melanie looked at her son with a mixture of coldness and remorse. The air in El Paso felt suffocating as the night stretched on, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired in the Collins household. As the seconds ticked away, Melanie's mind started to clear, the fog of rage lifting to reveal the gravity of her actions. She had killed her husband, her son's father, right in front of him. The blood on her hands was a constant reminder of the irreversible act she had just committed. Her mind raced as she stood over Tom's lifeless body. The rage that had fueled her initial attack began to fade, replaced by a sharp sense of reality. What now? How would she explain this? She couldn't just leave things like this. There had to be a plan. She had to think. She turned to her son, Jake, who was still frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. His face was pale, his lips trembling. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at her with an expression of disbelief. The young boy had seen everything, and now he was caught in the web of her madness. Melanie could feel the weight of his gaze, and for a moment she almost felt guilty. Almost. She walked toward him, her movements slow, purposeful. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I had to do it. You saw what he was doing. He was hurting you." Jake flinched as she approached, but he didn't speak. The room felt heavy, suffocating, as if time itself had stopped. Melanie reached out, gently brushing his cheek, trying to calm him, but she saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of her. He wasn't seeing a mother. He was seeing a monster. "Jake, I love you," Melanie said softly. "I did this for you." Still, Jake didn't respond, his face blank as he processed what had just happened. The silence between them was unbearable, and Melanie's mind screamed for an answer. Some sort of reassurance that everything would be okay. But there was no answer. There was only the blood-stained floor and the corpse of the man who had once been her husband. Melanie stepped back, her eyes now scanning the room. Her gaze landed on the phone next to Tom's body. She could call the police. She could tell them everything. How he had hurt Jake, how she had snapped. But no, she couldn't. The evidence, the blood, it was all damning. She would be arrested. And her son? Would he be taken away from her? She couldn't bear the thought of losing him too. Instead, she grabbed the phone, wiped her fingerprints from the screen, and tossed it into the drawer of a nearby desk, hidden from view. Melanie turned to her son, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave. We have to go." Jake didn't respond. His eyes were still fixed on Tom's body, unable to process the tragedy unfolding before him. Melanie's heart ached for him, for the life he would now have to lead, one that would never be the same. But she couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. She took Jake by the arm, gently guiding him away from the scene. "We need to get out of here," she repeated more forcefully this time. "Do you understand?" Finally, Jake nodded, though his expression remained blank. He was in shock, and Melanie knew it. She could only hope that he would come to understand, come to forgive her for what she had done. But that was a distant thought. For now, she just needed to get away, get them out of the house, away from the blood, away from the death. Together, they left the guest bedroom, making their way through the darkened hallway, avoiding the parts of the house where memories still lingered. The front door creaked open as Melanie led Jake outside into the cold night. The air was crisp, sharp, as if the world itself had rejected what had just occurred. Melanie didn't know where they would go, only that they needed to be far from the house. The idea of staying there, of facing the aftermath of her actions, was unbearable. The house, once a symbol of family and security, now felt like a prison. As they reached the car, Melanie hesitated. Could she really drive away? Could she leave everything behind? But then she remembered the look on Jake's face, the fear, the confusion, and she knew she had no choice. She had to protect him. They had to disappear, at least for a while. Melanie started the car, pulling away from the driveway, the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders like an anchor. They were leaving everything behind, but that was the only option now. No turning back. As the lights of the house faded in the rearview mirror, Melanie's thoughts turned to the future. What would she do now? How would she live with the guilt of what she had done? She didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The small town of El Paso had always prided itself on its sense of community. In a place where everyone knew each other's name, it was hard to imagine anything that could shatter the peace. But Melanie Collins' actions that night shattered the calm, setting off a ripple effect that would soon reach every corner of the city. The news of Tom Collins' death spread quickly. His murder on the night of what should have been a quiet evening sent shockwaves through the department, and soon enough, it was a case that no one could ignore. Detective Lauren Westbrook, a seasoned investigator with over a decade of experience, was assigned to the case. She had seen it all in her time with the El Paso Police Department, from drug busts to brutal assaults. But there was something different about this case, something that unsettled her. Maybe it was the nature of the crime, how it had been committed by someone so close to the victim. Maybe it was the thought that this could have been a domestic dispute gone tragically wrong. Or maybe it was just the sheer violence of the act itself. Either way, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than met the eye. As Lauren walked into the Collins home, she felt the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. The house was still a crime scene, the air thick with the smell of blood and tragedy. Melanie's absence was palpable, and the only signs of life were the officers who had been dispatched to secure the scene. Lauren surveyed the scene, her eyes taking in every detail. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. Tom Collins had been caught off guard in his own home, murdered in what appeared to be a fit of rage. The bloodstains on the floor told the story of a brutal attack, and the position of the body suggested that Tom had never seen it coming. But there was no way to know for sure just yet. Her first priority was to find Melanie Collins. There was no question that she was the primary suspect. The question was, what had driven her to kill her husband? Tom Collins had been a well-known officer in El Paso. He had served in the police department for over 15 years, rising through the ranks to become a respected figure in the community. He had a wife, Melanie, and a young son, Jake. From the outside, their family seemed perfect, a picture of suburban normalcy. But that image began to crack under the weight of the evidence. In the guest bedroom where Tom had been found, there was a trail of blood that led to the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, and inside the detectives found what they had expected but dreaded to see: Tom's clothes hastily discarded, as if someone had been in a hurry. There were signs of a struggle, but nothing that suggested a break-in. Everything indicated that Tom had been killed by someone who had been close to him, someone who knew the house well. Lauren turned to her partner, Officer Mark Reynolds, who had been collecting evidence. "Any sign of Melanie?" Mark shook his head. "Number, but we found her car in the driveway. It's gone now, though. We're running the plates." Lauren nodded, taking a deep breath. "She's our prime suspect, but I need to know more. Who was Tom Collins, really?" The officers continued their work in silence as Lauren moved through the house. She needed to understand the dynamics of this family, how everything had fallen apart so quickly. If she could figure that out, she could piece together what had happened. She moved to the living room, where framed family photos lined the walls. Smiling faces stared back at her. There were pictures of Tom and Melanie at holiday gatherings, at their son's soccer games, celebrating birthdays. The perfect family, at least on the surface. Lauren felt a pang of discomfort. It was too easy to judge, too easy to assume the worst. She had been in this job long enough to know that things were rarely as they seemed. There had to be more to this than just a domestic dispute. A few hours later, Lauren was back at the police station, reviewing the initial reports. There was still no sign of Melanie Collins, and the more they dug into her background, the murkier things seemed to get. Her relationship with Tom had been rocky for years, according to neighbors and family friends. Tom's work had kept him busy, and he had been away from home often. Melanie, on the other hand, had become more isolated, her once vibrant social life fading as the years passed. It seemed that the cracks in their marriage had been showing long before that night. But what about their son, Jake? What had he seen? Lauren knew that if they were going to solve this case, they needed to talk to him. But it wasn't going to be easy. Jake was only 8 years old, and the trauma he had experienced would be hard for him to process. Still, It was the only lead they had left. Detective Westbrook sat at her desk, reviewing Jake's school records. He was a quiet child. His teachers described him as bright but withdrawn. No surprise there, considering what had just happened. Suddenly her phone rang. "Detective Westbrook," she answered, her voice steady. "Lauren, it's Mark," came the voice on the other end. "We found something. Melanie Collins. She's at a hotel just outside of town." A cold shiver ran down Lauren's spine. "Do you have her?" "Not yet, but we're on our way there now." Lauren stood up, gathering her things. This was it. This was her chance to finally get some answers. She grabbed her coat and headed out of the office, her thoughts racing. She couldn't help but wonder what Melanie would say when she finally came face to face with the woman who had murdered her husband. Detective Lauren Westbrook was on edge as she drove toward the hotel just outside of town. The search for Melanie Collins had turned into a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, and now Lauren was just moments away from confronting the woman who had brutally killed her husband. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her, but Lauren had learned long ago that in this line of work, emotion could cloud judgment. She had to remain focused. The hotel was tucked away on the outskirts of El Paso, far from the bustling streets of the city. It was the kind of place you'd only find if you were trying to lay low, a place where the quiet hum of the neon sign outside the window could almost lull you to sleep. But inside, things were far from peaceful. As Lauren pulled into the parking lot, her mind raced. What could Melanie possibly say? What would be her explanation for Tom's murder? Was it simply a crime of passion, or was there more to the story? Lauren couldn't stop wondering about the dynamic between the Collins family. She'd seen it before. Families that looked perfect on the outside but were hiding dark secrets. The question that haunted Lauren was whether Melanie was truly a victim of her circumstances, or if she had acted out of something far more sinister. Inside the hotel, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Lauren and Officer Mark Reynolds approached the door to room 215. Melanie's car had been spotted in the parking lot a few hours earlier, and there was no mistaking it. The time had come to speak with her, to bring her in for questioning. Lauren took a deep breath and knocked firmly on the door. "Mrs. Collins," she called out, her voice steady but firm. "This is Detective Westbrook with the El Paso Police Department. We need to talk." A long pause followed, and Lauren could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps on the other side. Then the door opened slowly, revealing Melanie Collins. She looked nothing like the woman Lauren had expected. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from what must have been sleepless nights. Her once pristine appearance was now disheveled, as if she hadn't cared about how she looked for days. There was a blank expression on her face, one that suggested she was either in shock or trying to remain composed under immense pressure. "I'm Detective Westbrook," Lauren said, her voice softening slightly, but still carrying authority. "We need to ask you some questions about your husband's death." Melanie's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and confusion. "I don't know anything about that," she whispered. I didn't do anything." Lauren took a step forward, trying to gauge Melanie's reaction. "We found evidence that places you at the scene of the crime. We need to know what happened that night." Melanie flinched at the mention of evidence, her hands trembling slightly. I I don't know. I don't know what you mean." Lauren's instincts told her that this wasn't the whole truth. There was something more, something Melanie wasn't saying, but she knew that pressuring her too much could backfire. Instead, she tried a different approach. "Let me ask you this, Mrs. Collins," Lauren began, her tone calm but firm. "Was your marriage to Tom really as perfect as everyone thought? Or were there things going on behind closed doors that we don't know about?" Melanie's face twisted with emotion at the mention of her marriage. For a split second, Lauren thought she saw a flicker of anger in her eyes, but it was gone just as quickly. "I loved him," Melanie whispered. "I loved him so much. But he wasn't the man I thought he was. I don't know what happened. He just changed." Lauren watched as Melanie's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. There was a growing tension in the air, and Lauren could feel the weight of Melanie's unspoken words hanging between them. "Tell me what happened that night," Lauren pressed, her voice softening as she took a step closer. Melanie's eyes welled up with tears as she spoke. "I came home early that evening. I wanted to surprise him. Things had been so strained between us, and I thought maybe we could work things out. But when I walked in, I saw something. I saw something I can never forget. Her voice broke as she spoke, and for a moment Lauren saw the raw pain in her eyes. She was torn. Was this the truth, or was it just another manipulation? But she couldn't deny the pain in Melanie's voice. "What did you see, Mrs. Collins?" Lauren asked gently. Melanie's shoulders slumped as she let out a shuddering breath. "I saw him with our son. He, he was hurting him. I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't." Lauren froze, the air thick with the horror of what Melanie was saying. She had suspected that there was something dark behind the Collins family's image of perfection, but she hadn't prepared herself for this. Melanie's voice dropped to a whisper. "I confronted him. I told him I couldn't live with someone like that. I told him I would protect Jake at all costs. And then, I don't remember what happened after that. I just know that when I looked down, he was lying there, dead." Lauren stood in stunned silence, processing what she had just heard. Was this the truth, or was Melanie simply trying to justify her actions? The story sounded too horrific to be a fabrication, but Lauren had been burned before by stories that seemed real on the surface. "Mrs. Collins, I need you to come with us," Lauren said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "You're under arrest for the murder of your husband." As Detective Lauren Westbrook led Melanie Collins out of the hotel room and into the waiting police car, she couldn't shake the weight of the confession she just heard. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the story didn't seem to add up entirely. Was it truly an act of self-defense, or had there been more to it than that? Melanie's emotional breakdown seemed genuine, but the detective's instincts were still in overdrive, pushing her to dig deeper. The drive back to the station felt like it took hours, though it was only a few minutes. Melanie sat in the back seat, staring out of the window, her face pale and stricken. It was clear that she was unraveling, but Lauren wasn't sure if that was due to guilt or the trauma of what she had witnessed. Either way, she needed to keep pressing. Once they arrived at the station, Melanie was taken into an interrogation room. The officers on duty took their time with paperwork and routine procedures, but Lauren couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. She had to get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. Lauren sat across from Melanie, who had been silent ever since she had been arrested. The detective leaned forward, placing a notepad on the table, her pen ready. She needed to hear more, to uncover the truth buried beneath the layers of grief and rage. But Melanie wasn't making it easy. "Mrs. Collins," Lauren began, her voice calm but assertive, "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened that night. You've told me part of the story, but I need more. You say your husband hurt your son. Can you tell me exactly what you saw?" Melanie's hands were trembling as she wrapped them around a cup of water the officer had placed in front of her. She stared down at her hands for a moment before looking up at Lauren, her eyes wide and filled with fear. I, I didn't think it was real," Melanie whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to believe it, but when I walked into the room, there they were. Tom and Jake, my son, my little boy, was on the floor, and Tom, he was standing over him. He was yelling at him. I couldn't even understand what he was saying. But then I saw it. I saw Tom touching him, and I knew. I knew in my gut what was happening." Lauren leaned forward, trying to make sense of it all. "You're saying your husband was abusing your son?" Melanie nodded, her lips trembling. "Yes, he was. And I couldn't let him hurt Jake anymore. I didn't know what to do. I had never seen Tom like that before. I didn't know who he was. I couldn't let him hurt my baby." Lauren's mind raced as she processed the gravity of what she was hearing. The details of the crime scene were still fresh in her mind. Tom Collins had been found dead in the living room, a gunshot wound to his chest. At first glance, it had seemed like an impulsive act, but now hearing Melanie's account, it felt more like an explosion of suppressed. "Wait, what did you do after you saw what was happening?" Lauren asked, her voice soft but insistent. Melanie took a deep breath, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "I don't remember much after that. Everything happened so fast. I grabbed the gun. It was in the drawer by the door and I don't even know what I was thinking. I pointed it at him. I wanted to make him stop, but then he lunged at me and I panicked. I shot him. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't stop myself. The silence in the room was thick, and Lauren could feel the weight of Melanie's confession. It was chilling, yet it also rang with a sense of truth. But there was one thing that didn't sit right with her. If this was self-defense, Lauren asked carefully, why did you leave the scene? Why didn't you call for help right away? Melanie's eyes filled with tears again, her face twisting with regret. I, I couldn't. I couldn't stay. I just couldn't. I was scared and I didn't know what to do. I had to protect Jake. He was still in the house, and I didn't want him to see what I had done. I didn't want him to think that I had killed his father. She paused, looking down at her hands and then back at Lauren. I couldn't face anyone, not even Jake, so I ran. I didn't know where to go. I just needed to get away. Lauren nodded slowly, her mind piecing together what she had just heard. Melanie's actions might have been driven by a sense of protection for her son, but there were still too many holes in the story. The gunshot wound suggested a close-range shot, almost like an execution, and the fact that Melanie had fled the scene without contacting the authorities only added to the suspicion. Lauren's next step was to corroborate Melanie's story. She needed to dig into the family's history, uncover any signs of abuse or tension that might have led to this tragic event. But it wouldn't be easy. The Collins family had always been seen as the picture of suburban perfection. No one had suspected that the cracks in their foundation were so deep. As Lauren got up to leave the interrogation room, she turned to Melanie one last time. You understand that the investigation is still ongoing, right? Your statement doesn't clear you of any charges. We still need to gather evidence. Melanie nodded, her face blank. I understand, she said softly. But Lauren wasn't convinced. There was more to this story. There had to be. As she walked out of the room and into the hallway, her mind raced. The pieces were starting to come together, but Lauren knew that the investigation was far from over. She would have to dig deeper into the Collins family's past and into the darkness that Melanie had finally revealed. The night was quiet as Detective Lauren Westbrook sat alone in her office, staring at the case files in front of her. The investigation into the murder of Tom Collins had consumed her every waking moment. She was no closer to understanding the full truth, and the weight of the case pressed heavily on her shoulders. Melanie Collins's confession had been chilling, but there was something off about the whole thing. Something didn't sit right. Lauren took a deep breath and sifted through the pile of papers, hoping for some clue, some piece of evidence that might finally make sense of it all. She reached for the crime scene photos again, the image of Tom's lifeless body etched into her mind. The gunshot wound was severe, but the angle suggested that it hadn't been fired in a panic. No, this shot had been deliberate. The fact that the bullet had hit him square in the chest, dead center, spoke to a cold calculation. The problem with Melanie's story was that it didn't fit the physical evidence. A mother's instinct to protect her child, yes, that could explain the violent act. But the execution of it didn't align with the panic and fear she had described. The question that gnawed at Lauren's mind was whether Melanie had acted out of self-defense or whether she had planned to kill Tom all along. Had she been waiting for a reason to end it all? Lauren reached for the phone on her desk and dialed the number for the forensic lab. It had been 2 days since they had processed the crime scene, and she had yet to hear back on the autopsy report. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Detective Westbrook, a calm voice answered on the other end. We've just completed the full autopsy report. There are a few things you should know. Lauren's heart rate quickened as she leaned forward. Go ahead. Tom Collins didn't die instantly from the gunshot wound. He lived for several minutes after being shot. The damage to his heart was severe, but not fatal immediately. The cause of death was a combination of the gunshot wound and blood loss, but he could have survived for a while before succumbing to the injury. Lauren's mind raced. So, he was conscious after the shot? Yes, the forensic pathologist confirmed. We found traces of blood near his hands, which suggests he may have tried to stop the bleeding himself, but ultimately he couldn't. This was a significant revelation. If Tom had been conscious after the shot, it meant that Melanie's story about him dying instantly was false. He had been aware, perhaps even in shock, when he realized what had happened. What if during those final moments he had tried to defend himself or fight back? What if he had pleaded for his life? Anything else? Lauren asked, trying to keep the urgency out of her voice. The gunshot wound was close range, the pathologist continued. The gun was likely fired at a distance of 2 feet or less. There's no indication of struggle at the scene, and the position of the body suggests that Tom was standing when he was shot. He wasn't facing the shooter when the gun was fired, which could imply that he was caught off guard. Lauren processed the new information. Tom's final moments had been far from the chaos that Melanie had described. He hadn't been lunging toward her. He hadn't been attacking her. He had been standing, likely unaware of the danger. The details began to paint a different picture, one that suggested a calculated act of murder, not self-defense. Lauren thanked the forensic expert and hung up the phone, her mind still racing. She knew she needed more to confirm her suspicions. Melanie had to be hiding something. She had to figure out what had really happened that night. The following morning, Lauren called in a few of her trusted officers to help her dig deeper into the Collins family's background. She needed a more thorough investigation into Tom and Melanie's relationship, something that might explain why things had escalated to murder. They started by going over old police reports. The couple had always appeared to be the picture of suburban perfection, but Lauren knew that appearances could be deceiving. After hours of digging, they found something. There had been a report filed a year prior, an incident at the Collins household. It was a domestic disturbance call, but the details were sparse. There was no record of violence, and the case had been closed with no charges pressed. The officer who had responded to the call had made a note that the couple appeared to be emotionally distant, but that no physical altercations had been observed. Lauren's eyes narrowed as she read the report. It seemed like a minor issue at the time, but now, in the context of the murder, it took on new significance. What had really happened behind closed doors? Melanie had seemed so sure of herself when she described Tom's actions the night he died. Was it possible that she had been holding on to resentment, to rage for a long time? Her officers began to question neighbors, co-workers, and friends who had known the Collins family. What they uncovered was telling. Tom's colleagues at the police department described him as an exemplary officer, quiet, professional, and respectful. But no one had any idea about the troubles he might have been facing at home. No one suspected the darkness that had crept into the Collins household. The breakthrough came when they interviewed Melanie's close friend, a woman named Carla Jones. Carla had been a frequent visitor at the Collins home, and her observations were more revealing than Lauren had anticipated. Melanie was always the one who kept everything together, Carla said when Lauren pressed her for information. Tom was never around much. He worked long hours, and when he came home, he wasn't really present. But Melanie? She was always there for Jake. She took care of everything, but you could tell she was exhausted. She'd confide in me sometimes. Talk about how Tom was distant, how he was always out with his buddies from work. I think she felt alone in that marriage. This was the piece that Lauren had been waiting for. It wasn't that Tom had been abusive toward Melanie or Jake. It wasn't even that there had been physical violence, at least not until that night. What it seemed like was a growing distance, a deep sense of isolation, and a feeling of abandonment. Melanie had reached her breaking point. Her trust in Tom had eroded, and she had been left to deal with the emotional fallout alone. But then the most shocking detail came through during the interview. Carla mentioned something that sent chills down Lauren's spine. Melanie said something strange to me a couple of days before Tom died. She said that if she ever had to choose between her son and her husband, she would choose Jake every time. She said, "If it ever comes down to it, I'll protect him, no matter what." Lauren's heart skipped a beat. Could it be that Melanie had already made up her mind long before that fateful night?